Okay, you guys found the room? Yeah, because last time a bunch of you guys didn't find the room. And then I got some emails, and apparently some of you guys didn't know how to open the door. So in the Clinton Theater, if some other guys ask you about it, you know, the lecture theater is sort of hidden. Yeah, you need to go to the ends of the corridors, and that's where the door is. So let's get started with our first substantive lecture about analytical sociology. What is analytical sociology? And before we do that, I have a little quiz for you guys. Right? So I mentioned that we're going to do these kind of things here. So take out your phones, your tablets, your electric toothbrushes, whatever you use to update your Instagram, your Facebook status or whatnot. Right? So take it out, and we're going to have the first question about the first reading. Right? So last time I assigned you the first reading for this lecture. It was a text by Alan Sokol. It was in Blackboard. Okay. The text was called "The Transgressing the Boundaries of Quantum Gravity," and what was this text about? Please. Okay. Have you guys done the reading? This article is complete bullshit. I played a prank on you. Actually, this article will come back to that, caused a huge outcry in the scientific community. Because this guy here, Alan Sokol, and we will talk about him in a bit, he is a physicist, so he knows his shit. He wrote this article, Transgressing the Boundaries of Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And you read into it, and there's a lot of postmodern crap, and it sounds fancy and pretentious, but it's complete bullshit. So the guy submitted this article to this respected journal, Social Text, it's a cultural studies journal, and it got accepted. Right? It got published in a special issue on Science War. Right? And then the day after, the guy Alan Sokol published another article in Lingua Franca, another journal, where he revealed and where he described how he fooled the editors. Well, we'll come back to that in a second, but this article, or maybe you didn't read it, you just thought it sounds nice. Yeah. I said something about quantum gravity, and you thought it's about physics and how this affects the way we think and so on. But in this article, he basically says that, but I will come back to that in a second, he writes beautifully. He writes, it's very intelligent, right? But he writes how quantum gravity, that's something about the billions of the smallest millimeter of what you could imagine, right? How that affects how our political processes go. That's complete mumbo jumbo. Anyway, now some of you guys are picking it up, but so I pranked you, and this reading is not required for the exam at the end, right? So this required reading, please forget about it. Okay, but there's a serious point here, and the point is maybe you guys don't notice, or maybe you guys haven't seen that. You are in your second year, people tell you stuff, and you believe it. Yeah. So there are people like me or some lecturers, they tell you other things and you believe it. But sociology, when you look at it, is highly, highly fragmented. People have very different ideas about what good sociology is. People have very different ideas about what we should do. Right? And this course is actually it's a particular idea, how we should do sociology. And I hope to convince you that we shouldn't write crap like transgressing the boundaries of quantum gravity. So there are big debates within sociology, and I'm teaching also the first years on sociological research methods, and there I'm reading up on the general thing. I'm thinking I should give them an objective view, tell them about all the things. Not everybody has to do the things that I do, or maybe they find something else interesting. But the thing that really strikes me in that context is that sociologists don't even agree on the very basics. We don't even agree on how we come to know something. We don't even agree on how we explain something. Or even more, some people say we shouldn't explain something at all, because we can't explain something to begin with. It's all a social construction. So sociology is very scattered. It's very different from other disciplines. Well, luckily, some colleagues of mine told me that other disciplines are even more scattered, like anthropology or so. They're even more at war with each other. But within sociology, that's something you really need to keep in mind. As you go through your career and as you take different classes and so on, there are different kinds of, or sometimes it's called schools of thought, right? There are different ideas about what sociology should be all about. Okay, so when you want to understand analytical sociology, and that's what this whole course is all about, you need to understand where it comes from and where it tries to get away from. So there are two things that people got really, really frustrated about, and banged their head against the wall and thought, this is just not good. Let's get away from this. The first one is complicated nonsense, where the paper by Alan Sokol was a prime example. This got into a journal, serious people read it, thought there's some intellectual value about it. Well, what he actually did, he pleased the editors with certain opinions, right? That kind of, they liked this idea that the way we think about society should be altered because of new developments in quantum mechanics. So they liked that idea that we are affected by these developments. So the second, on the other side, so that's on the one side, right? So we have people being very imprecise, being very unclear, being very postmodernish. On the other side, we have these are not technical terms, so please don't tell anybody Dr. Grund told me mumbo jumbo and variabilities. Yeah? These are just the things that I sort of thought are useful concepts here for you to understand stuff. So on the other side, people went completely aboard, completely bazooka, and said, okay, all we need to do is have fancy statistical models. We need to relate this thing to the other thing, and then we have a mathematical description of that, and that sort of explains everything. Right? So sometimes we call that variable sociology, because people talk all about the variables, how they capture something, and then they lose sight. Then they just correlate the variables with each other. They run their regression, which is important to do, but they forget about what's actually happening here. So they forget about how do we get from the one point to the other. And to some degree, analytical sociology tries to remedy both of these things. So first, mumbo jumbo. Yeah. So I said, this was this article, Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. Yeah. If you haven't read the article yet, Google Sokol Affair. Right? It was a big, big thing. It was a big thing. The guy had submitted this article, as I said. The editors accepted it. What it even revealed is sort of how the academic system is sometimes problematic, because they didn't even send it to somebody who could have understood it. Right? So it was mumbo jumbo. Throughout the article, Sokol employs scientific and mathematical concepts in ways that few scientists and mathematicians could possibly take seriously. Yeah. So he employs some crazy terms like morphogenic fields, some bizarre new age concepts in physics, very speculative about the small stuff. You know, as I said, it's about how something, quantum gravity is about something on the scales of a millionth, of a billionth, of a billionth, of a billionth of a centimeter, right? How that affects political life. And the best thing is he wrote that how this is progressive, right? So the kind of how we can change that, and he threw in a whole bunch of fancy sounding word, and it just reads beautifully, but it's complete crap. So that was the Sokol Affair. And the whole thing was a hoax. Yeah? He wrote the second paper in Lingua Franca where he revealed that it was a hoax, and where he showed in detail where his transgressive boundaries did not make any sense at all. It was a big outcry in the academic community. Lots of people found it hilariously funny, yeah, including me. While at the same time, it was said that it revealed some academic standards which had deteriorated the field. So it was gibberish, but it was beautifully written gibberish that sounded intellectual and sounded pretentious. Never do that. So never think you need to be sounding pretentious or intellectual just to make a sociological point. That's completely off the map. I think it needs to be extremely, extremely clear. And that's kind of the really cool stuff. When you read the good articles, and the good articles you find in sociology has a very clear two top journals, right? That's the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review. Unfortunately, it's very American-centric, but these are clearly the absolute two top journals in the field. So if a guy like me wants to get tenure at an Ivy League university, I need to have published in these journals. And when you read these journals, you understand why. Because that's really the best stuff of the field. And in there, these articles, sometimes you read them, and then you wonder, oh, this is so straightforward, this is so easy. How could that have ended up in that journal? That's a huge process. Sometimes it takes 5, 8 years, whatever, to get into this journal and get accepted. Yeah? That's sort of what we academics do. But that's the point of it. Writing simple is sometimes extremely difficult. But that's what you need to aspire for, to be clear and to be straightforward. So as I mentioned, some people say we can't even make explanations. They just wave their hands and say all we can do is interpret things, we can describe things. I don't agree with that. I think if we do that, we would give up everything. And I think a lot of things are very real. It's not a social construction. Some people are very poor, right? And that is very objective. That's not a construction. They are poor, and that affects how they live their life, right? Okay, so that was mumbo jumbo, variabilities, as I said. There was one other extreme that kind of took off and people got fed up with in the last few years, that the people kind of got more and more technical, very statistical, and it was all about the variables, and they lost sight about what's actually happening, right? So here, the idea was that the whole thing was pretty mindless statistical or mathematical exercise. Yeah. Okay, by the way, these things are still happening, right? So there are still people that kind of write a lot of gibberish, and there are still a lot of people who are completely into variable sociology, and this whole analytical sociology is a rather new thing. So that kind of is sort of where people just really got frustrated over the last 10 years and came together and said, okay, we need to change this. And more people are doing this now. So the solutions are clarity and precision, right? And a mechanism-based approach. And we come back to that in a bit. So clarity and mechanism-based, it's all about how things are being generated. Okay, so analytical sociology, as I said, is a bunch of people that came together, and sometimes it's a very interesting thing to study anyway, how academic fields come together, right? Or how academic schools of thoughts come together and so on. This is relatively new. It's maybe 10 years old, and the term analytical sociology itself was actually coined 8 years ago. Actually, I was there. I was just in the middle of it. It was my PhD advisor who in Oxford, where I did my PhD. So the guy, Peter Hedstrom, he's the founding father of this analytical sociology idea. right? There are many other players now as well. Many other people came into the scene. And I remember we started this off sitting around, what people do in Oxford. They sit around, drink coffee, and talk pretentiously. No, not pretentiously, but very clear and very straightforwardly. But there were only a small bunch of people. And now it turned into a big academic community. There are annual conferences. Actually, in June there's one where I'm going in the Netherlands. And there are more and more publications about this. There are a whole bunch of books that came out into the field, including one that I wrote. So this is sort of the one that I edited. This one, you find me as well. There's also a contribution in there. There's also the big one is the Handbook of Analytical Sociology. So these are sort of the books, and you will see quite a bunch of the texts that I prepared for this class on Blackboard, where you can find them when you read them, are from these books there as well. Okay, so what is analytical sociology? Well, sometimes it's not that easy to actually describe something when you're in the middle of something. So also I'm using a quote from Gianluca Manzo. It's a friend of mine who edited the last book here. In his introductory chapter, which is under the further readings for this week's lecture. So when you click on Blackboard, look at the readings. There's sort of required readings and further readings for each week. Right? Click on it. There you find it. So he had this one definition that I'm now going to use as an example, because I think it captures many of the different things what analytical sociology is about, and we will take this definition more or less apart. Okay, so here he says, analytical sociology is the sociological perspective that seeks to systematically formulate and empirically test micro-founded, mechanism-based explanations of complex macro-level patterns and dynamics. Okay, let's start this one after the other. First of all, he says it is about explanations, right? We want to explain something. And that might sound obvious. Yeah, for me, it's a no-brainer. Yeah? I think when I'm in this field, I want to explain stuff. Yeah, I just don't want to describe things. But a lot of sociologists say, no, explanation should not be our main goal. And some people say we cannot make an explanation. They say the only thing we can is interpret, because you experience something completely different than I do, and your world is completely different than mine. Well, of course, our perceptions might be different. And actually, I'm very fascinated by that, and actually look at that in my substantive work as well, about how our networks around us influence how we see the world. And that leads to these crazy, crazy things, and we're going to talk about that your friends have more friends than you do, and in fact, your friends are actually, on average, more attractive than you. I love to tell this to the big dudes at conferences and in their face, because it's deductive logic. So our immediate networks totally influence us. But I don't think, because of that, we should wave our hands and say we cannot make any explanations at all. So I think explanations or explanatory research is what we should be striving for. So just a brief summary, that's one of those slides that I had yesterday for the first years. Different types of research. Some people say we can only interpret and criticize. The next step is we can have descriptive research, like being very, very solid about how we describe stuff, what, where, when. And the last one, I think that's sort of what we, sort of the gold standard of the whole thing is explain stuff, right? This is sort of where the satisfaction comes from, when we have a clear idea about why things happen or how they happen. Okay, so what does Gianluca say what we should explain? Well, macro-level patterns. What are macro-level patterns? That's just this general stuff, like social inequality, segregation in the world, things are separated and so on. Basically, it's about not explaining individual behavior, but the patterns that lots of different individual behaviors produce. That's sort of what sociology is all about to some degree, right? We're looking up there. If we would be down there at explaining individual level, we would be psychologists or maybe social psychologists. So you want to understand sort of the macro level patterns about how societies look like, what are sort of typical beliefs, what are norms, how do people behave, what are structures, what are the institutions they have, things like that. Right? So that's sort of the macro level patterns. We have the micro level. For us in sociology, these are the individuals, and the macro level, that's sort of the societal entities, right? And a lot of sociology, when you go back to the classics, Emil Durkheim, I hope you guys read some Emil Durkheim or heard about Emil Durkheim in one of your intro classes last year. He was very much about, so what are those things at the society level? Do they exist? Do they have sort of an entity by themselves? Do they have what we call ontological value, right? Or how can it be, if they don't have that the whole is sometimes more than the sum of its parts, right? So that society is sort of something different. There's a culture emerging, or there's sort of a spirit or something like that. So that's sort of what a lot of sociology is concerned about, to kind of understand this thing. Sometimes it's called the micro-macro link, structure and agency. Maybe you heard that term. It's Anthony Giddens, another great guy who talks mumbo-jumbo once in a while. Actually, I have a funny story about Anthony Giddens, but I should tell this another time. Anyway, okay, so it's a chain about macro-level patterns. The next thing what Gianluca says here is we should be systematic and we should be empirical about it. Right? So we want to have an explanation, and we should derive our conclusions through systematic research and through empirical research. Well, let's backtrack a little bit. So, how actually do we know things, right? And when you think about it, well, you might think, okay, how do we know things? It's pretty obvious. But actually, it's not that obvious, and probably it's what we think in terms of knowledge acquisition academically or here at the university might be different from what you might have been used to before. Well, first of all, some guys say we actually know nothing, right? When we can never know anything. Okay, I'll just leave it like that. Well, we might know something because somebody tells us, right? It might be a book, it might be a teacher, it might be a dude sitting in front of you with a beard, right? And that's probably the mode of knowledge acquisition that you guys are most familiar with. So at school, somebody told you about stuff. But believe me, at university, this is sort of what university is all about, taking you away from that. It's all about taking you away from just simply hearing something and saying, okay, that's sort of what it is. But it's going towards you making your own judgments and being systematic about it. Right, kind of acquiring knowledge in a systematic way. And that distinguishes it from the third way of gaining knowledge. It's through our own experiences, through common knowledge. It's not a bad idea to know something. You run out to the rain, you realize at some point you will get wet. Right? After all, you are an island. This is just how it is. But our own experiences and our common sense is good in giving us heuristics about our daily life. Right? This is sort of how our brain developed, right? To live our life, sort of. But our common sense or our own experiences, they're sometimes incredibly bad in putting things in a wider context. Well, the reason for that is you only remember the things that you actually experience. You don't remember the stuff that you don't experience, right? And you have a very hard time understanding the things that you don't experience and comparing the things that you do experience against them. Well, to give you an example, I'm sure we all have these stories. Actually, I'm collecting these stories right now, so I'm interviewing random people about this stuff because I want to write something about it. So these crazy stories where you travel around the world, or I don't know where you are, so somewhere completely crazy. You are on this island, or you get stranded, or I don't know. It's just, or you're just somewhere where you normally not are. So you're out of your routine, and then you turn around, and there is somebody you know from home, or something. Or you need something and you walk around and something is on the floor that you need, right? So, for example, I had it the other day. I like to listen to my music when I come here, and these earbuds, and then you lose these earbuds, and then the earphones, then you have a problem. Right? It doesn't really work that anymore. So I was actually hiking for a long time, and I had lost these earbuds. And God damn! Now I have another 200 kilometers ahead of me, and I don't have an earbud. So what am I going to do? Right? So, but the moment I realized that and said that to myself, I looked down the floor and there was an earbud. Right? So, whoa, hang on a moment. How could that be, right? Well, the thing is, you only remember when these things happen. You don't remember when these things don't happen, right? You don't remember about all the things that could have happened and don't happen. So the probability for these incredibly rare events, they are incredibly small. But believe me, the probability that one of these incredibly rare events happens in your life at some point is incredibly high. It's incredibly high. And we cannot put that in context because think about all the other people that you could have met on the island or somewhere. And think about all the other days in your life when nothing happened. It was just a boring day. Yeah, and you didn't remember these kind of things. So our brain is incredibly bad with these kind of things. And I think we're going to talk more about that at some point as well, but let me press ahead. So the last way, and this is sort of what university is all about, let's be systematic about it, right? Systematic research. Keep in mind, some people say this is not what we should do. I have a hard time understanding that. Okay, what is being systematic? Well, systematic means let's use a scientific approach to this, right? Here I have a definition of science. A systematic process for evaluating claims about empirical observations and organizing conclusions into cumulative knowledge. Empirical observations is kind of the stuff that we see, right? We collect some data in whatever form. It can be interviews, it can be some surveys or whatnot, right? And then we try to organize that data in some way so that we can derive some conclusions from it, that we can generalize from it and say something more general about the world around us. Or the general way how we go about it, we develop a claim, we have an idea, a theory, then we make some testable hypotheses about it, we come up with some measures and whatnot, we test this, we derive conclusions, we revise our theory. So that's sort of how the textbook thesis is going to look like. Well, the point here is it's about theory and observation. So we have a theoretical layer and we have an empirical layer, and we connect these two things with each other. We basically use induction and deduction. Deduction means we deduce theoretical claims towards make some statements, and then we test them with empirical observations. We induce then general principles from the empirical data. Okay, Gianluca also writes about analytical sociology being micro-founded. Micro-founded. Well, you already heard me talking about these things, macro level or micro level. Right? So it's kind of big and small. That's basically the whole thing. Something higher, something lower. Yeah? And for different disciplines, these things mean different things. Right? So probably, I don't know, for psychologists, the macro level would be the individual, like kind of what your emotions are, and the micro level would be the chemical level, of how certain neurons are fired in your brain or whatever the hell is happening there, right? And this aggregates then to the individual. Yeah? For us in sociology, micro-foundation means looking at individuals. So these are sort of these are our actors, right? Society consists of you guys, individuals, right? And we all together, we form society, and then we have sort of macro-level phenomena at a societal level that we can look at. And believe it or not, these things are also contested. Yeah? Well, here, analytical sociology takes a stance and says that individuals act, right? You guys do something. It's not that the state does something or that culture does something. Of course, these things do matter. That's not what we're saying here. That would be ridiculous to say that macro-level phenomena don't matter. But ultimately, you decide what you're going to do. You decide. Am I going to take notes? What am I going to have for lunch? What am I going to have to do afterwards, right? So these are the things at the end. It's about individuals act within social context. Yes, right? And they even alter social context. Yes, and they even have ideas about what social contexts are and what other things, what the social context is. Yes, but ultimately it's individuals who do something. Okay, so that's sort of this general idea of micro-macro, to get to micro-foundation of macro outcomes. We'll talk more about it. I don't know if it's next week or I think at the end of next week we'll talk about it. So that's sort of this general principle. This is sort of the graph that you will see over and over and over again in the literature. It's also known as Coleman's boat, because it looks a little bit like a boat. And last time I gave you an example of this, how we could use this schema, this micro-macro schema to, for example, explain the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism. Yeah? So these are macro-level things, right? This is not individuals. It's sort of capitalism is sort of a macro-level thing. Yeah? And this was this idea that Max Weber had, he observed, capitalism came about in Protestant countries. A micro-founded explanation of this would be now the following: that Protestantism itself doesn't do anything. Protestantism doesn't say, okay, now we're having capitalism. Did any Protestant ever said we need to be capitalists? No. However, what it does do is it affects the values that individuals have, right? Which is the Protestant, which is living an ascetic life, because if you would be wasteful, you would be wasting your time that you could use otherwise to honor God, right? And that kind of, these values lead to economic behavior, because that is an expression of how faithful I am, how good a Christian I am, right? Because I'm serving God, right? And I shouldn't waste my time. And then when everybody behaves in that way, everybody becomes economically in what they do, we end up with capitalism. So that's in a nutshell how this micro-macro thingy goes, and what the point of a micro-founded explanation is. Okay, talk about mechanism. So mechanism is the big buzzword, right? And mechanism, people got very excited about, although it's not that straightforward actually to define a mechanism. But to understand what a mechanism-based explanation is, let me tell you first about how people made explanations before, or particular strand of explanations. So there's what we call the deductive nomological model of an explanation. So that's also known as the Hempel-Oppenheim schema for explanation. So this is philosopher of social science, Hempel and Oppenheim, so this is sometimes you think, is this trivial or what? No. But when you start thinking about that, these things are actually not that straightforward. How do we make an explanation? And in their world, or in that world, we have two things. We have the explanans, that's what explains something, and we have the explanandum. The explanandum is what you want to explain. So let's say I want to explain why is there segregation in the world, right? Or why is there a certain norm prevailing? Or why the hell do we have water charges, right? So these kind of things you want to have, this is the kind of the stuff that you want to explain. That's your explanandum. And then the things that you use to explain that on the other side, that's your explanans, right? So because our government is bad, or because we went through a bus, we don't have the money, we cannot afford giving away free water, right? So that would be the explanans on the other side. Let me give you the 1 minute talk about the philosophy of the social science. So I hope that you guys pick these things up at some point. I kind of pushed this yesterday in my first year lecture, because I think people should know about this. So first, what is deduction? Deduction is this idea that this guy, René Descartes, came up. He was a moral philosopher. And his idea was, we should draw conclusions from the stuff that we know. What is the thing that René Descartes is most famous for? Quote, somebody knows? René Descartes.
Think, therefore I am.
Oh, there is one. This is brilliant. I think, therefore I am. Exactly. That's what he said. So the guy, he said, he was questioning, do I exist? Right? And then he realized, hang on a moment, I find myself thinking about that. Right? So I'm doubting whether I exist or not. But then he realized, hang on, only things or beings or entities that do exist, they can doubt themselves. Right? So that was his first deduction. I'm thinking, and only things that do exist can think, so hence I must exist. So that's drawing something from things you already know. And often we use that in sociology as well. We have a general idea, a general theory that we think is true, and then we think, okay, if that is true, what would it mean? Right? Let's say we know that people protest when they are unhappy about their government. Now we see in Ireland there are water charges, people are very unhappy about that. Then we would deduce from that, okay, people will protest in Ireland. That's a deduction. And then we go about and test this deductive claim, right, with some data. That would be then induction. to draw something from, but deduction is sort of drawing something from things that we already know. Then the nomological part here means law-like. So that means, or here's in the deductive nomological model, the idea is that we can find some general laws about the world, about the society, how things run, right? And then deductive nomological explanation has basically this form. It's often this if-then, right? So if there's a fire, then there's smoke, right? So smoke is what we explain, and if is sort of the thing, okay, how we explain it, right? And this is a model of explanation that a lot of people use. Well, you notice there's a lot of things happening here in between that are not so clear. So how exactly do we come from the one to the other, right? Because now we only see there's a fire and there's smoke. Is that really an explanation? It's just we relate these things. We know when there's always fire, there's smoke, right? But there's a black box here in the middle. And that's kind of the stuff that people were frustrated about with these variable sociologists, because they didn't bother, or they didn't have the idea about how to unpack this this box in between, right? So it was sort of some mindless things in between. So the question was, how can we explain something without knowing what's actually happening? You know, what are sort of the processes that lead the one to the other? And this is sort of why, you know, analytical sociology is also so obsessed about this precision, this clarity, and so on, because we need to be very clear and precise if we want to know exactly what's happening. The solution is a mechanism, right? Mechanism is sort of this thing in between our explanans and explanandum that kind of gives us a plausible story about how we get from the one to the other, right? So how can we define a mechanism? Well, a mechanism, there are different definitions out there, but you know, here are some useful ones. Mechanism consists of entities with their properties and the activities that these entities engage in, either by themselves or in concert with other entities. The concert is important, you know, and we will come back to that in a while. Entities, you know, it could be individuals, it could be whatever, the state, and they do something in a way, right? And they do something all together and then something in a particular way. So it's about what they do and their configuration with each other, and that leads to something at the end, right? So these activities bring about change, you know, there's something happening at the end, and the type of change is brought about upon the properties and the activities of the entities and the relations between them. So, you know, Peterson sort of and Petr Wielkowski have then this definition here. A mechanism is a constellation of entities and activities that are organized such that they regularly bring about a particular type of outcome. I think we wonder, oh God, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, come on, that's sort of what we would expect. But believe it or not, it's actually not a brainer, not a no-brainer in the field. To distinguish this again, you know, this is sort of what a lot of people did before. They connected the dots. You know, there's fire and there's smoke. That's sort of what they did. They connected the things. Analytical sociology tries to understand how we get there, right? How we arrive there, and what are the elements involved in that, and how do they all interact with each other, and how, when they all behave in a certain way and they are all dependent on each other in a certain way, how this then leads to the other thing. So it's about the generative processes, how something comes about. Okay, complex. Well, complex. So we want to explain complex macro-level patterns. There's this idea of complexity. You know, this is sort of a beautiful complexity plot, you know, which is something that looks very complicated, but actually it's being produced through very simple rules. So complexity, and in the social sciences we sometimes talk about the complexity turn as well. Complexity is not complicated. Not at all. Actually, for me, complexity is the opposite. It's very simple. It's very simple in how things come about, right? So you have very simple rules about how certain, I don't know, individuals or molecules or whatever it is, you know, since they behave somehow with each other, and then they kind of bring about a complex pattern. And that kind of is sort of a change in the society right now. And actually, you know, if you guys believe it or not, you are at a place right now where this is really cutting edge right now. So UCD is a great place to be right now to do computational social science. We have 3 faculty members right now who do these kind of things. And the idea here is not just to use computational models or anything. You know, that, as I said, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's really about understanding these things, that one thing affects the other, which 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 affects the other. And these kind of things, and then all together they produce the macro level pattern, right? And that's sort of a different understanding of the social realities that we have around us. Well, it doesn't mean that everything depends on everything in a way, but some things do, and if we don't consider that, and that's sort of what this course is all about as well, you will realize we might have very wrong ideas about how things came about and what we should do about it, right? Okay, it means from going away from factors to actors, so away from our variables that describe something, going towards individuals that behave. As a natural consequence, we'll talk about that next week, networks and network science are a crucial part. So that's sort of actually where my field is. I do social network analysis, but it's motivated from an epistemological point of view, right? So I think, okay, we make an explanation, right? We need to know what's happening. Individuals behave in a certain way, but they kind of depend on others. Here we are, social networks matter. Dynamics. Well, if you haven't noticed yet, this course is a lot about dynamics. You know, I mentioned the example of the traffic jam last time. There are these tipping things. The whole idea is that something starts, something else happens because of that, something else happens because of that, something else happens because of that, and so on. And that is sort of a fundamental element of our social world. Just look around you. You know, just look around. Actually, I did yesterday this funny joke. I shouldn't tell you yet because I want to play this prank with you as well later on. Anyway, I made a little social influence experiment yesterday with 500 first years, and it actually did happen. It worked out. I was very pleased. So what is the novelty of analytical sociology? Well, it lies in the independence among the elements. Again, you will think, oh God, this is what this guy talking about. Yeah? But this is actually, a lot of people don't see that as the thing that we should do, right? And I'm baffled by how 90% of our statistical analysis that we do assume that our observations are independent from each other. How can we do that? We run some analysis where you think that I'm just looking at your class background or whatnot, and I look at what you do, but I look at all of you in isolation from each other. Doesn't that defeat the whole point of sociology? I think the core idea in sociology is that there is a difference between individuals being isolated and individuals being in groups, in communities, in societies, and so on, right? The whole is more than the sum of the parts. So the idea is social life is inherently dynamic and interdependent. Okay, to give you a little graphical representation of this, right? So we can do descriptive research. And I think it's very noble, and I think that's where all good research starts. So when I have my PhD students talking to me, the first thing I tell them is hammer out the phenomena that you're looking at. Be very clear and precise, describe it. That's the first paper you're going to write. When you have a bachelor thesis, it's the first thing you have to do after your introduction and so on as well, too. You have to describe the thing, right? So we look at the thing, we look at the elements in the world, and we describe them. Actually, we could even describe how they move, right? We're describing it. If you want to be explanatory then, if you want to do some explanation research, well, you look at other things moving as well, right? So you're connecting the dots. You see this thing moves and this thing moves. There's fire, there's smoke. There we are. And then maybe you control for lots of other things, and maybe there was somebody else smoking around, or maybe there was something else, right? But that's sort of what the idea here is, or what the idea in this deductive nomological way of explaining something is. It's connecting the things. Analytical sociology, but connecting the things and being clear about how you get from the one to the other, right? Seeing how not just how the dots are connected, but sort of what are the transmissions, what are sort of the mechanisms that lead from the one to the other. And the reason why this is important, because you might get it really wrong, right? If you don't get this, how the one leads to the other, if you don't get that right, you see something that kind of two wheels spin in a certain direction, but if you would have understood that actually the mechanism that links them is actually something different in a way, then you would have gotten a completely different picture. Okay. And then we can spin this further on, and we can talk about, okay, well, there's just a lot of different things are connected with each other, and that's sort of the motivation I always give, or that's sort of the epistemological foundation for me, why I'm doing a social network analysis, because then you have individuals that depend on each other. There we are. Okay, so that was our first lecture. Forget about Alan Sokol, please. Transgressing boundaries, quantum hermeneutics, whatever, but please do read for next week this article by Bickel. It's a very short article. You find it in Blackboard. I have it under readings, week 2, required readings. If you want to read up on some other stuff that I talk about, go into readings, week 1, and there you have further readings. So there you also have the detailed syllabus and a lot of other stuff that you can read on. All this stuff is on Blackboard. Okay, see you next week.